In less than 5 minutes on live television, Bill Maher tried to corner Jasmine Crockett with jokes, mockery, and one brutal question. If you're this sensitive, why are you in politics? But what happened next stunned his entire studio. Jasmine raised the standard, delivering a response that flipped the entire conversation. So what exactly did Jasmine say? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The email hit Jasmine's inbox just after 6 a.m. Subject, Invitation to Real Time with Bill Maher. Segment on free speech and cancel culture. No warmth, no context, just a sterile block of text. We'd love to have Congresswoman Crockett join us for a spirited discussion. Spirited. She read it twice. It wasn't an invite. It was bait. She tossed the phone onto the counter. Maher didn't want a conversation. He wanted a spectacle. By 8 a.m., she sat in her campaign office, blazer crisp, coffee untouched. Reese stood in the doorway, invite in hand. They're not calling you to speak. They're calling you to fall. Jasmine didn't blink. She stared at the screen behind him. Cancel culture, like crosshairs. Push back. They'll cut your mic. Stay quiet. They'll call you weak, Reese warned. Not paranoia, pattern. She turned to the window, watching sunlight stretch across her city. If I say no, they'll say I'm scared. If I say yes, they'll come for blood. Then she turned, calm and clear. Let them. If it's a mind game they want, I'll play, and I'll win. She paused. Book it. She didn't flinch when she said it. Book it. But when the car turned off Fairfax Avenue and slipped behind the gates of CBS Television City, Jasmine felt the change in the air. Not nerves, not fear, just that thick, invisible pressure she knew too well. The kind that follows you when you walk into a room knowing you weren't invited to be heard, only to be handled. From the back seat, she watched the building rise out of the dusk like a monolith. Clean, glossy, impressive, but cold. As the car stopped, the silence inside felt louder than the LA traffic outside. She stepped out, heels striking concrete with calm precision, not for show, but as a reminder, to herself and anyone watching, that she didn't come to play their game quietly. Inside, the hallway was eerily still. No laughter, no greetings, no assistant rushing forward with a clipboard. Just a long stretch of fluorescent light and polished tile that reflected her every step like a spotlight without warmth. Her arrival wasn't acknowledged, just logged. A silent intern gave her a nod. No name, no smile, and pointed vaguely down the hallway. She walked, eyes sharp, catching glimpses of camera gear and stagehands pretending not to see her. Then came the sound. Laughter, loud, familiar, performative. It leaked through a half-open door, and when she glanced over, she saw him. Dalton Briggs, white, loud, smug, a conservative commentator who built his brand laughing at people like her, not with them. And now he was laughing again, with producers, with staff, with comfort. One of them touched his shoulder as if they'd known each other for years. Someone handed him a cappuccino. His mic was already clipped on. Jasmine entered her own green room. No producers, no coffee, no prep. Just a folding chair beside a crooked side table and a lukewarm bottle of water that had already begun to sweat. There was no welcome, just walls, white, blank, and soundproof. It was quiet in a way that didn't soothe. It excluded. It said, "You're the outsider here. Don't forget it." She looked at the mirror. It didn't flatter. It didn't lie. And she didn't need it to. Her hair was already perfect. Her blazer, a soft navy with structured shoulders, sat on her like armor. She didn't come for decoration. She came for war, if that's what they wanted. She sat without slouching. No scrolling through her phone, no pacing, just stillness and observation. Every moment was a message. She could see the setup already. When she entered that stage, they'd expect her to be tense, defensive, cold. The camera wouldn't pan to her until the first jab had been thrown, and then it would linger, hoping she'd flinch. That was the real set design, unwritten but deliberate. Silence wasn't absence. It was the first act of control. Her fingers moved slowly, brushing a thread from her lapel that wasn't even there. Then she exhaled, low and steady, and murmured a line she'd said to herself in dozens of rooms just like this. But this time it rang heavier, like steel drawn in a quiet room. "I didn't come here to be comfortable," she whispered. "I came here to be right." The studio lights snapped on like a switchblade, warm to the audience but glaring to the guests. Jasmine stepped onto the stage without flinching, her heels steady against the polished floor, her blazer catching just enough of the light to remind them she came prepared, not styled. She took her seat, nodded once, and let her gaze sweep calmly across the room. It wasn't curiosity, it was calculation. She'd studied this terrain long before tonight. She knew which cameras stayed wide, which ones lingered when a guest hesitated, and more importantly, she knew exactly what this crowd expected her to be: reactive, defensive, and too easy to rattle. She wasn't going to give them that, not tonight. The applause sign flashed. The crowd responded with robotic rhythm, and Bill Maher leaned forward in his chair, like a man about to set a trap he thought no one else could see. His voice had that trademark smirk woven into it, half laugh, half lecture, the tone of someone who mistakes cynicism for insight. "Joining us tonight," he began, "is Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the bold, unfiltered face of a new political wave. You might recognize her as the poster child for the generation that cancels everything but their own outrage." Laughter erupted, polite and sharp. It wasn't joy, it was approval. That familiar, smug approval of a room that had already decided which side it was on before the conversation had even begun. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't shrink. She didn't smile because they were laughing. She smiled because she knew exactly why they were. Her smile wasn't for them. It was armor. Her eyes locked on Maher's, and in that single look was a message. "I know what you're doing, and I came ready." She adjusted her posture, lifted her chin a fraction, and responded not with volume, but with precision. "Or maybe," she said, voice like a steady tide, "I represent the generation that's done being quiet while everyone else gets to rewrite the rules and call it progress." The silence was instant, cold, dense. It wasn't just that the crowd stopped laughing, it was that they hadn't expected to be spoken to like that. The rules of the game had shifted mid-play. Maher blinked once, that smug curve at the corner of his mouth softening ever so slightly, as if some part of him realized she wasn't there to provide good television. She was there to tell the truth, and she didn't need their permission to do it. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't lean back or pile on. She simply folded her hands, crossed one leg over the other, and waited. Still, controlled, like someone who had just walked through the front door of the very fire they built for her and didn't burn. Maher recovered quickly. He always did. Like a man used to slipping out of corners he'd painted himself into, he leaned back, fingers steepled, and dropped his next line with deliberate weight. "You know," he said, the grin returning like a blade behind glass, "it seems like every time someone disagrees with your side, suddenly it's about race, gender, trauma, whatever identity card happens to be most useful that week." A few chuckles scattered through the audience, uneasy but obedient. He pressed on. "You call it justice. I call it victim culture. Everyone wants to be the underdog now, because it means no one can challenge them without getting accused of oppression." He shrugged, feigning neutrality, but the venom was unmistakable. "It's like disagreement equals bigotry these days, and frankly, that's not discourse. That's emotional blackmail." Jasmine didn't react, not visibly, but something in her eyes changed, the way metal shifts in a forge before it strikes. She held still, every part of her calm, but charged, like the quiet before a thunderclap. She knew this script. She'd heard this line before, dressed up in 100 different suits. This wasn't debate. It was deflection dressed as intellectualism. Maher wasn't asking a question. He was drawing a boundary, one that gave him permission to dismiss any experience he didn't share. She let the silence stretch for a beat too long, just enough to make it uncomfortable, just enough to make him, and the audience, feel the weight of his own words. The tension thickened, not like conflict, but like gravity pulling the moment towards something inevitable. The silence after Maher's comment didn't feel empty. It felt tight, like the whole room had stopped breathing, waiting to see if she'd laugh it off or explode. Jasmine did neither. She sat still, hands calm in her lap, eyes focused. This wasn't new. She'd been in rooms like this before. Rooms where people with power said loaded things and expected her to either smile or shrink. She did neither. When she finally spoke, her voice was low and steady. No anger. Just a truth she'd carried for years. When a system keeps failing the same group of people over and over, she said, speaking up about it isn't about playing victim. It's about staying alive. The air in the studio shifted. It wasn't a punchback. It was a correction. Clean. Director. Her words didn't bounce. They sank. She looked at Maher. You think people bring up race and gender just to shut down conversations? She tilted her head slightly. We bring them up because those things shape how we're treated. Every day. At work. At the doctor's office. At the polls. She paused just long enough. It's not convenient. It's reality. Maher opened his mouth, then closed it. She didn't wait. In my district, polling places in black neighborhoods get shut down quietly right before elections. People wait 2, sometimes 3 hours just to vote. Some leave, some can't stay because they have to get to work. That's not a complaint. That's the truth. Now she turned to the audience, her tone still calm but firmer. I've sat in meetings where a woman brings up a solid idea and no one responds. 10 minutes later, a man says the exact same thing, and suddenly it's brilliant. She let the silence settle before continuing. You can't tell me that's just coincidence, and you can't tell me pointing it out means we're being sensitive. She looked back at Maher. You say people today are too quick to cry oppression, but maybe that's just because people like me are finally being heard, and maybe that makes some folks uncomfortable. Her eyes didn't blink. But discomfort isn't oppression either. The room was still. Nobody was laughing now. Jasmine kept her voice steady, almost quiet, but each word landed with force. It's not that we want to talk about race or gender every time. It's that we don't have the luxury not to. Ignoring it doesn't make it go away. It just makes sure it stays broken. Maher shifted in his seat. For the first time, he looked like he wasn't sure what to say. He reached for his water. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't press. She let the silence do the work. The crowd wasn't clapping, but they weren't breathing either. Finally, she leaned back, not to relax, but to hold her ground. You don't have to agree with me, but you're not going to twist what I lived through into a punchline. Her tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. She wasn't debating anymore. She was setting the terms. And now, for the first time all night, the room belonged to her. The last thing Jasmine said had stripped the air of its usual comfort. No laughter, no sarcasm, just truth. Clean, firm, and echoing. Maher's face held its practiced calm, but his fingers twitched against the edge of the armrest, and that trademark smirk was beginning to look more like a reflex than confidence. He leaned in, but not to listen, to retake control. Look, I'm just asking a question, he said, hands out like he was being reasonable. If you're this easily offended, if just being challenged makes you upset, why are you in politics? This isn't personal therapy. It's public service. A few people in the crowd chuckled, unsure if they were laughing with him or at the trap they saw forming. Maher sat back, confident again, like he'd just won a round. His posture said, gotcha. His eyes said, let's see what she does with that. Jasmine didn't move, not a twitch, not a blink. Her silence wasn't hesitation, it was a pause with purpose. She could feel it, the air thickening, the cameras waiting, the audience leaning in for a reaction. But there was no flash of anger, no cutting comeback. Just a breath, deep, even. And then her voice, quiet, precise, the kind of calm that cuts deeper than shouting ever could. The question isn't the problem, she said, eyes locked on his. But the way you ask it, that tells me you've never had your voice taken from you. The room froze. A wave of stillness passed over the studio like a held breath. Not one sound, not one shuffle in a seat. Even the cameras seemed to slow. Jasmine leaned forward now, not aggressively, but with the weight of someone carrying years of unspoken truth. When you've had to fight just to be heard, when your presence in the room feels like a challenge to the people already there. Being calm isn't weakness. It's survival. Her words were soft but sharp, each one hitting with surgical precision. I'm not in politics because I bruise easy. I'm here because I've been bruised before, and I'm still standing. I know what it means to have something taken from you before you ever got the chance to speak. Maher didn't respond. Not right away. His hands stilled. The audience didn't laugh. No applause, no cues. Just tension, real and raw, pressing down on everyone equally. And Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't smile. She just let it hang. The silence, the truth, the weight of what was just said. Because in that moment, she didn't win the argument. She changed the rules. The silence still lingered from Jasmine's last line. A silence so complete, it felt like the walls of the studio had leaned in to listen. She had cut through the noise without raising her voice, and in that brief, brutal stillness, she had done something rare on live television, made the room feel real. But she wasn't done. She shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers lightly brushing her blazer sleeve, as if steadying something inside. Then calmly she said, "Do you want to talk about tone? Let's talk about tone." Maher raised an eyebrow, ready to strike, but Jasmine kept going, measured, unwavering, surgical. 3 months ago, I sat through a House oversight hearing. 5 minutes into my opening remarks, I was interrupted 17 times. 17. Her voice didn't tremble. If anything, it was clearer now, like someone describing a crime scene they've walked through 100 times. And when I finally asked, very calmly might I add, to be allowed to finish my sentence, the chairman leaned into his mic and said, "Congresswoman, don't be rude." A murmur ran through the audience, low and uncomfortable. Jasmine let it sit, then added, "You know what's wild? I didn't raise my voice. I didn't slam the table. I didn't even break eye contact. But somehow I was still the problem." Maher chuckled lightly, trying to break the tension. "Well, to be fair, maybe it's not what you said, but how you said it." That line should have sounded harmless, but it hit like a slap. And Jasmine's expression didn't change, but her eyes sharpened. She turned to face him fully now, not combative, not dramatic, just clear, devastatingly clear. "Ah, now I see," she said quietly. "When you speak directly, it's called being sharp. When I speak directly, it's called having an attitude. That's the difference I live with." The audience didn't laugh. They didn't breathe. They just watched, eyes fixed, waiting to see what came next. Jasmine leaned forward slightly. "Let me tell you what that moment in the hearing felt like. Imagine being asked to speak, then told you're too loud the second you do. Imagine watching your male colleagues yell, interrupt, posture, and get praise for being passionate. Then imagine doing none of those things and still being labeled as aggressive. That's not about tone. That's about control." Maher opened his mouth, then closed it. She wasn't done. "I've had my words picked apart more than the content of what I'm saying. I've had people call me angry before I've even opened my mouth. I've had to smile when I'm being talked over, because if I don't, I'm called difficult. I've had to nod politely while being insulted, because if I push back, I'm unprofessional." She paused just long enough for every word to sink in. "And somehow in all of that, I'm still expected to prove I belong in the room." The lights above the stage buzzed faintly, but the audience was still frozen. No applause, no murmurs, just faces that looked like they'd been slapped with reality. Jasmine's tone never wavered. She wasn't performing. She was telling the truth. And truth, when it cuts clean, doesn't need to shout. Maher tried again, this time softer. "But don't you think sometimes people hear you that way because they're not used to being challenged?" Jasmine turned her gaze to him, measured but unblinking. "No," she said plainly. "They hear me that way because they're used to being comfortable. And I don't make them comfortable." She took a breath. "And you know what? That's not my job." Now she looked out at the audience. Not for applause, not for effect. Just to make sure they heard this next part. "My job isn't to fit the mold. My job is to break it. If the mold was designed to silence people who look like me, talk like me, or come from where I come from, I'm not here to be palatable. I'm here to be effective. The crowd was silent, but it wasn't the kind of silence that waits for the next joke. It was the kind of silence that says, I've never thought about it like that, and now I can't unhear it. Maher sat back in his chair now, arms still crossed, but less sure. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then let it close again. Jasmine didn't flinch. You say I'm too much? She said, voice low and steady. I say for too long, we've been told to be less. Less loud, less direct, less visible, less real. And what has that gotten us? Nothing but the illusion of access, without the substance of power. She adjusted the lapel of her blazer, not as a gesture, but like someone brushing off dust they'd carried for too long. So no, she continued, I won't soften just to make someone else more comfortable. I won't shrink just to stay in the room. I've earned my seat, and I'll speak like someone who has. Then she leaned back, not to rest, but to let the words stand alone. And they did. They stood like steel in the air, unshaken, undeniable. For the first time in the entire interview, Maher looked small, not humiliated, but humbled, because Jasmine hadn't yelled. She hadn't cursed. She hadn't even raised her voice. She just told the truth, calmly, clearly, and without asking permission. The audience still didn't clap, not because they weren't moved, but because it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like something sacred. And sometimes the only right response to something sacred is silence. The silence still hadn't broken. Not truly. It lingered like heat after lightning, thick with everything that had just been said. Jasmine hadn't raised her voice, but somehow she had raised the stakes. She wasn't just responding anymore. She was drawing a line. And now, with his usual rhythm disrupted, Maher leaned forward, not to listen, but to take back control. Maher straightened in his chair, his tone tightening like a belt around a slipping argument. Let's not make this about race, he said, trying to sound measured. It's not about your skin color. It's about how we talk to each other. That's what this is about. Civil discourse. Tone. He gestured lightly with one hand, like he was diffusing tension, but Jasmine saw it for what it was. A pivot, a redirection, the same script she'd heard in every polished room where discomfort dressed up as neutrality. But she didn't bite. She didn't lean in or lean back. She just looked at him, steady, like someone staring across a chessboard, 2 moves ahead. When she spoke, it wasn't loud, but it was final. See, she said gently, that's the difference right there. You say it's about how we talk, but real dialogue isn't when one side gets to ask all the questions and the other side has to stay quiet just to avoid being labeled as too sensitive. Her voice didn't shake. If anything, it landed sharper because it didn't need volume. The room exhaled, just barely, and then shifted. You say it's not about race, she continued, her eyes never leaving his. But only one of us keeps getting told to watch their tone. Only one of us is being told that being direct is a problem. Maher opened his mouth, but the audience moved first. A ripple of applause began from the back row. Small, tentative, and grew. This wasn't the kind of clapping that followed a joke. It wasn't forced or performative. It was slow, solid, earned. The kind of applause that didn't say we agree, but we understand now. Jasmine let the sound roll, but didn't ride it. She waited for it to fade before she continued, never losing the thread. This isn't about attacking anyone, she said. It's about naming the pattern. Because if we can't even talk about the double standard, about who gets to be blunt and respected, and who gets labeled difficult for speaking up, then we're not having a conversation. We're just protecting the comfort of the loudest person in the room. The tension was back, but it was different now. It wasn't defensive. It was reflective. You could feel it in the stillness of the crowd, in the way people leaned forward slightly, drawn not by drama, but by truth. Maher tried to salvage it. But don't you think tone matters? I mean how we say things. It changes how people hear us. Jasmine nodded. Sure, tone matters, but only when it's judged equally. And it's not. She held out a hand, open-palmed. When a man interrupts, he's assertive. When I say, please don't interrupt me, I'm combative. Her hand dropped slowly. That's not tone. That's bias. Again, silence. Real silence. Not the kind that falls flat, but the kind that listens. She looked out at the studio, eyes scanning across the lights, the cameras, the watchers behind the glass. "We say we want honest conversation," she said, "but only if it's comfortable. We say we want different voices at the table, but only if they don't speak too loud or too fast or too real." Her voice dropped, just slightly. "That's not dialogue, that's a performance. And I didn't come here to perform." No one moved, not Maher, not the guests, not the crew. The audience sat in a still, focused silence that didn't ask for a follow-up. It demanded reflection. Then Jasmine looked back at Maher, her tone softening just enough to feel human again. "You're not the enemy," she said, "but sometimes you don't even see the stage you're standing on, because it was built for your voice to carry, built for your jokes to land, built for your discomfort to mean something, and mine to be ignored." Maher blinked, and for the first time that night, said nothing. He sat still, jaw tight, eyes locked on hers. But he didn't challenge her, because he couldn't, because she wasn't fighting. She was explaining, and everyone in the room felt it. Jasmine folded her hands together, her voice gentle now, but unshakably firm. "I want real dialogue, but real dialogue means both sides have to be allowed to speak, and be heard, and not be punished for how their truth sounds coming out of their mouth." The lights felt warmer now, the air heavier. Someone in the front row whispered, "That's it," barely audible through the mic. Another person nodded. And just like that, the room didn't feel like a studio anymore. It felt like a reckoning, because Jasmine Crockett had said what so many had felt and never been allowed to say out loud. In that space, under those lights, on that stage. Not without being called angry, or difficult, or too much. But this time, no one dared to call her that. They just listened, because finally it wasn't about winning the exchange. It was about telling the truth and making sure it echoed. Jasmine walked off the set with her spine straight and her silence louder than applause. The studio doors closed behind her, but the fire she lit didn't stay in that room. It ran. Through wires, into servers, onto screens, through fingers, and what started as a single moment became a national echo before she even reached the parking lot. The clip hit the internet less than 20 minutes after airtime. No flashy headline, no celebrity endorsement, just raw footage, 6 seconds long, her face steady, her voice calm, her words cutting through noise like steel through fog. "I'm not being small, I'm being clear." It spread like a spark in dry wind. Within hours, it was on every major platform, subtitled, repackaged, reshared by strangers, teenagers, veterans, CEOs college professors. Her line became a headline, then a hashtag, then a movement. By 1 a.m., her name was trending across every platform. Not being small hit #1 on X, followed closely by Wansha Crockett Clarity. Edits of her face, overlaid with quotes, appeared on Instagram Reels. A dozen TikTok creators stitched themselves reacting to the moment, some nodding in disbelief, others in tears. In one clip, a woman in her 60s pressed her hand to her chest and whispered, "Finally, someone said it for all of us." But Jasmine? She sat alone in the back seat of a black SUV crawling through downtown Los Angeles, her phone lighting up every 4 seconds, her name ringing from devices she couldn't see. Reese sat beside her, jaw clenched, phone in hand, reading updates as they poured in. "CNN wants you in studio tomorrow. Maddow's team is asking for a quote. Fox is calling it the new face of liberal fragility, which for them is probably a compliment." He paused. "MSNBC said you cracked the country open." Their words, Jasmine didn't react. Her eyes stayed fixed on the city lights outside, her hand resting on the armrest, still. Inside the hotel room, the air was thick, thicker than before the show. The kind of weight that settles when you realize the story isn't in your hands anymore. It's in theirs, on their screens, in their interpretations. Reese turned on the TV. There she was, already. A guest panel on CNN was debating whether Jasmine Crockett had redefined assertiveness or weaponized identity. One commentator called it a masterclass in restraint. Another called it strategic victimhood, masked as clarity. The volume stayed low, but the noise still crept in. She turned it off. Her inbox was a war zone. Dozens of requests in bold subject lines. Today Show interview? Anderson Cooper? The View wants to book you Friday. The offers came with high-profile hosts and higher stakes. But Jasmine scrolled past them all. No response. No reply. Just one sentence to Reese. I'm not doing any of it. He looked up from his phone, confused. None of them? Even the friendlies? She nodded, slow and deliberate. They want a headline. I gave them a boundary. Reese leaned against the desk. You know what comes next if you stay quiet. Yeah, she said. But I know what comes if I start talking, too. The next morning, the split was brutal. The Atlantic ran a piece titled Jasmine Crockett, The New Blueprint for Power. The Federalist countered with why not being small is the new political narcissism. A prominent radio host called her a disruptor with a persecution complex. A podcast dubbed her the woman who brought a scalpel to a shouting match. One op-ed accused her of playing the race card. Another called her the voice we didn't know we needed. But the wildest thing? She hadn't said a word since the taping. And that silence, intentional, razor sharp, became its own statement. The more they talked, the more obvious it became. She didn't need to defend her words. They were still echoing without her. Reese walked into the hotel room midday, holding a coffee and a list. 23 requests, 3 morning shows, 2 Sunday panels, even a call from NPR. Guy says he just wants to talk about posture and presence. She looked at the list once, then shook her head. Let it go quiet. Reese hesitated. You sure? Jasmine finally turned to face him fully, eyes clear. If I speak now, I become part of the spin. I want them to sit with what I already said. No edits, no smiles, no softened edges. He nodded slowly, understanding more than he said out loud. That night, alone in her room, Jasmine watched the city skyline through a window smudged by fog. In the distance, a helicopter hovered, probably media. Below, cars crawled like ants, everyone rushing to the next thing. But she didn't move. She sat with her breath, with the weight, with the knowledge that she'd said something unpolished, unscripted, and entirely too real for a culture addicted to sound bites. She opened her notebook, the same one she kept with her in every campaign. She flipped past policy notes, to-do lists, debates, speeches, and found a blank page. At the top, she wrote one line. They wanted a viral moment. I gave them a mirror. Then she closed the book, not the story, just the chapter, because the story wasn't over. It was just getting harder to control. And for once, that wasn't her problem. It was theirs. Jasmine had turned down the interviews, stepped back from the cameras, and let the echo of her words speak for themselves. What she didn't expect, what no one planned for, was what happened next. When the noise faded and the world began to whisper back in a different voice, it started with an email, simple subject line, from a viewer in Ohio. No staffer had filtered it, no publicist had flagged it. It slipped through the clutter and landed in Jasmine's inbox like a pebble in still water. She clicked. The message was short, just a few lines, but every word landed with the weight of a life lived differently. I've disagreed with you for years. I've rolled my eyes, cursed at my TV, even told my wife you were part of the problem. But when I watched you last night, I didn't see a problem. I saw something I never gave a name to, a woman refusing to bend so the world could stay comfortable. I think I've been wrong. She stared at the screen, not because it surprised her, but because it didn't. Deep down, she'd always believed people could hear truth if it was delivered without apology. And for once, someone had. A few hours later, her chief of staff forwarded a photo from a teacher in Columbus. It showed a teenage girl standing in front of a whiteboard, smiling nervously. Hand-drawn across her sweatshirt in permanent marker were 5 words, uneven but bold. I'm not being small. Below the photo was a caption. She watched your clip, then asked me, is it okay if I wear my voice like armor? Jasmine set the phone down and let her hands fall to her lap. This wasn't about politics anymore. It wasn't about right or left, cable networks or talking heads. These weren't applause lines. They were reflections, proof that something inside people had shifted. The kind of shift that doesn't come with cheers. It comes with stillness, with the quiet recognition that you've seen something you can't unsee. Not a performance, a recalibration, not a moment, a mirror. And through that mirror, people weren't just looking at her. They were seeing themselves. Some for the first time, some with shame, but more and more, with courage. Jasmine didn't need more noise. She didn't want to be quoted out of context, made into merch, or locked into another broadcast cycle built to monetize outrage. What she wanted now was something quieter, something stronger, something that couldn't be clipped or spun or erased. She wanted people to walk away not just remembering her, but remembering themselves. The door shut with a soft thud as the last staffer entered the room. The glass walls of her Dallas campaign office reflected the late afternoon light like it, too, had been holding its breath all day. Jasmine stood at the head of the table, not behind it. She didn't like distance, not when things were this important. There were 10 people in the room, her communications lead, her policy director, her youth outreach coordinator, her veteran strategist Reese, and 6 others whose eyes were equal parts exhausted and electrified. On the whiteboard behind her, someone had written in thick marker, "Now what?" Jasmine turned to face them all. Her tone was measured, but her gaze was iron. "Okay," she said, "let's talk about what we're not doing." A pause. "We're not chasing interviews. We're not feeding the machine. I've turned down CNN, MSNBC, Fox, podcasts, even NPR, because I'm not going to let a moment become a commodity." She walked to the board, uncapped a marker, and underlined the words, "Now what?" "Here's what we are doing. We're building something they can't clip." The table was quiet, not from confusion, but anticipation. "I don't want to be the viral congresswoman," Jasmine continued. "I want to be the woman who gave people a method, not just a message. I want to take that 6-second clip and turn it into 6 months of education, real civic literacy, real public courage." Reese leaned forward. "So what's the move? A video campaign?" "No," she said firmly. "A tour." Chairs shifted, eyebrows raised. She clarified, "Not political, educational. A civic engagement tour. Not about me, not about elections, not about flame wars. About how to stand your ground without setting everything on fire. About how to answer, not with rage, but with precision, with truth." She walked to the projector and tapped the spacebar. A map of the U.S. lit up the wall, states glowing in shades of orange and red. Locations where the quote, "I'm not being small" had spiked in searches and shares. It was everywhere. Not just D.C. or New York, but Amarillo, Flint, Boise, Mobile, Gary, Indiana. "They're listening," Jasmine said, "but they don't all have the tools. They don't all know how to respond when they're cut off, shouted down, gaslit, dismissed. They've got the fire. We need to give them the framework." Her policy director crossed his arms, skeptical but curious. "You want to train people to, what? Debate better?" Jasmine turned, eyes sharp. "Not debate, defend. Defend their dignity without losing their temper. Defend their values without feeding the outrage economy. Defend their right to speak, not with slogans but with substance." She clicked again. Now a slide with 4 bold words. Listen, clarify, confront, hold. "That's our model," she said. "Listen with full attention. Clarify the distortion, confront the lie, hold the line. That's how we win. Not by screaming louder, but by standing firmer." She looked around the room. No stages, no big donors, no fancy backdrops, just folding chairs, dry erase boards, and conversations that don't go viral, but go deep. Her youth organizer raised a hand. "You want to start with college towns?" Jasmine shook her head. "We start where no one else goes. Rural districts, underfunded schools, union halls, veteran centers, churches where politics are taboo. I want to talk to the girl who's the only one in her civics class asking hard questions. The factory worker who's been told to stay in his lane. The teacher who's afraid to speak up at the next school board meeting because someone will call her emotional. I want to teach them how not to shrink." One staffer murmured, "That's bigger than a tour." "That's a doctrine." Jasmine smiled, not wide, but deep. It's a defense strategy for democracy. The energy in the room shifted. Phones were pulled out, notes taken, calendars opened. But Jasmine raised a hand. Before we get into logistics, you need to hear one thing clearly. They looked up. I'm not doing this to prove a point, she said. I'm doing this because I'm tired of watching people survive rooms they should own. I'm tired of watching women and young people and people of color explain themselves over and over just to be heard. I'm tired of the false choice between being respected and being real. She took a breath. This isn't PR. This is repair. The silence that followed wasn't hesitant. It was reverent. Reese finally broke it. So what do we call it? Jasmine walked back to the whiteboard. Under Now What, she wrote, the Civic Clarity Tour. Then beneath it, slowly and in all caps, we're not being small. And in that moment, there was no applause. No cameras. Just purpose. And it was louder than any mic. The Civic Clarity Tour didn't begin with a fanfare. No press, no countdown, no cameras following her into the building, just wind cutting across a flat Oklahoma sky and the dull rattle of a rusted gym door as Jasmine Crockett stepped inside. Catoosa wasn't on anyone's radar. It was a quiet town with more grain silos than traffic lights, a place where people didn't go viral, they went to church. And that was exactly why Jasmine chose it. The gymnasium smelled like old linoleum and gym socks. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. No flags, no banners. Just 47 metal folding chairs arranged in a semicircle, half of them occupied. A chalkboard wheeled in from the middle school next door had the words "Clarity is Power" scribbled in clean white script. A few elderly locals sat with arms folded. A teenager in a hoodie stared into her phone. Two ranchers whispered near the back. They weren't here for a show. They were here out of suspicion, or maybe curiosity. Jasmine wore no mic, no podium, just a simple dark blue blazer and a thin notebook in her hand. She stood at the center, not above them, not behind anything, just there, present, bare, whole. She looked around and began, not with a lecture, but with a question. What does it feel like, she asked, voice even, to be silent so long that you forget what your voice sounds like? No one answered, but something shifted. A woman in the third row uncrossed her arms. A teenage boy at the edge of the row leaned forward. Jasmine continued, we're told silence is strength, that calm is control. But what if silence is just survival? What if being quiet is how we disappear piece by piece? Still no applause, just breathe. I came here, she said, not to talk at you, but to show you how to talk back, to a system that expects you to stay quiet, stay civil, stay small. A man in the back raised his hand. He was wearing a red flannel shirt and a John Deere hat. You really think talking different is going to change anything in Washington? Jasmine nodded slowly. I don't expect Congress to change overnight, but I know for a fact that a single sentence, said the right way, can stop someone from being steamrolled in a school board meeting, or fired unfairly, or dismissed because their voice shakes when they speak. He crossed his arms but didn't argue. She turned to the chalkboard, wrote 4 words in all caps. Listen, clarify, confront, hold. This is the framework, not for winning arguments, but for refusing to disappear. She pointed at each word as she spoke. Listen to what's being said beneath the insult. Clarify the distortion before it hardens into someone else's truth. Confront with calm, with facts, not fire. Hold your ground, your truth, your presence, especially when they expect you to shrink. There was no fanfare, no background music, just her voice, steady and soft. Someone coughed. The girl in the hoodie finally looked up. Then Jasmine pulled out a piece of paper. Let me show you something real. She held it up. It was a transcript of a congressional hearing, her own. 5 minutes, 17 interruptions, 1 accusation of being combative, not a single apology. She let the silence sit. And when I finally called it out, what did they say? That I was angry, emotional, disrespectful. A woman in the front murmured, that happens to me at work. Jasmine met her eyes. Exactly. And every time it happens, they chip away a little more of your voice until one day you stop raising your hand. She stepped back, let the room breathe. Then she said, "But what if you didn't?" A man raised his hand. "Easier said than done." Jasmine smiled. "That's why I'm not just saying it. I'm going to show you how." She pulled out a chair, sat down, and invited him to role play. He hesitated but came forward. "What's something you've been afraid to say in a meeting?" she asked. He rubbed his chin. "That we're understaffed, that safety's becoming a problem." "Okay," she said, "I'll be your boss. Push back on me." He nodded and began. "I think our team's stretched too thin. We need more hands before someone gets hurt." Jasmine responded, playing the part. "We've been fine so far. Sounds like you're exaggerating." He froze. "See? That's what happens. I back off." "Let's rewind," she said. "This time clarify before you confront." He tried again. "I'm not saying people aren't working hard, but the workload's doubled. I'm concerned about burnout and safety." Jasmine nodded. "Good, now hold. Don't apologize for the concern. Hold it, even if I sigh, even if I smirk." He exhaled, and the room clapped. Not loudly, not all at once, but it clapped, because they saw it, the shift. It wasn't about yelling. It was about staying upright when everything around you tells you to duck. Jasmine stood again. "We're not here to clap back," she said. "We're here to stay standing." A young woman stood next. "What do you say when someone says, 'You're overreacting'?" "Say this," Jasmine replied. "Maybe you're used to ignoring this issue, but that doesn't mean it's not real." The woman nodded, writing it down furiously. Then the boy in the hoodie raised his hand. "What if they just laugh?" Jasmine looked him in the eye. "Then you just became unforgettable because you didn't flinch." She stepped back again and addressed the whole room. "Don't worry about being liked. Worry about being heard. And once you're heard, be ready for the echo. Because once one person stands up with clarity, it gives permission to 10 more." She gathered her notes. There was no standing ovation, but people stood, one by one. They didn't cheer. They approached. A woman in a cafeteria apron handed Jasmine a sticky note before leaving. It said, "I didn't know I could say things like that. Now I want to teach my daughter to." A rancher pressed her palm and whispered, "I came in here with my fists up, but you didn't swing. You just stood. That takes more guts." Jasmine thanked them, shook hands, packed her things. When she walked out of the gym, the air was cooler, heavier with meaning. Not everyone had been won over, but they'd been moved. And in this fight, that was enough to shift the ground. When she got into the car, Reese was already checking the route for the next town. "You think it worked?" he asked, not looking up. Jasmine buckled her seatbelt, glanced once in the rearview mirror, not at herself, but at the empty gym door behind her. "It's not about if it worked," she said. "It's about who walked out of there standing taller than they came in." Reese nodded, then started the engine. The Civic Clarity Tour had begun, not with applause, but with recognition. They didn't throw tomatoes. They threw silence, smirks, and side glances. By the third stop of the Civic Clarity Tour, Jasmine Crockett felt it. The air was thicker, not with heat, but hostility. Not the kind that burns, the kind that coils. This time, the venue was in central Pennsylvania, a modest community center, just off a highway exit forgotten by GPS. The building was surrounded by flat gravel, rusted flagpoles, and a small group of protesters holding pre-printed signs. "She wants to cancel you." "Speech not equal feelings." "Crockett equals division." They didn't chant. They didn't scream. They just stood there, quiet, still, and armed with a weapon far more efficient than outrage: contempt. Inside, chairs were half filled, about 30 people, maybe less. Jasmine's team had arranged for 60. One row had only one woman sitting at the end, arms folded across her denim jacket like a locked gate. Reese whispered as they entered. "Local Facebook group tried to tank the event. Said you're bringing the woke virus into town." Jasmine didn't flinch. She set her folder on the table at the front and looked out into the dim, unamused room. This wasn't a crowd waiting to be inspired. This was a room waiting to confirm its doubts about her. That was fine. She had clarity. And clarity doesn't need applause. She stood. Before we start, Jasmine said, I want to name the room I just walked into. A pause. I see some of you looking at me like I've already said something wrong. But here's the thing. I haven't spoken yet. And that's part of the story. People shifted in their seats. Some looked away. Others leaned in, uncertain. I've been called a lot of things the last 2 weeks. Hero, problem, voice, threat. But the truth is, I'm just someone who thinks people deserve tools to speak up without being shouted down. A man in the third row, older, sleeves rolled up, jaw tight, raised his hand, not politely, but like a challenge. You say you're about free speech, but all I see is more division. You show up, and now half the county's fighting on Facebook. Jasmine didn't blink. That's not because I showed up. That's because no one ever taught us how to have a disagreement without making it personal. He scoffed. So now you're teaching manners? She stepped forward. No, she said. I'm teaching boundaries. Because the line between debate and dismissal is thinner than you think, and most people only notice it when they've been shoved across it. From outside, a knock echoed against the window. One of the protesters had pressed their sign against the glass. Stop playing victim. Jasmine turned, eyes locked. Funny thing about that word, victim, she said. People throw it like an insult. But let's be clear, pointing out a pattern isn't weakness, it's awareness. Naming that you've been silenced doesn't make you fragile. It makes you a witness. And some folks aren't scared of victimhood. They're scared of people who stop accepting it. A ripple moved across the room. Not quite agreement, but discomfort breaking. Another hand rose. A younger man this time, dressed in flannel and worn boots. You talk a lot about race, gender, power, but why always identity? Why not just talk like we're all the same? Jasmine nodded slowly. Because we're not all treated the same, and pretending we are doesn't unify us. It erases people. I'm not here to make you feel bad. I'm here to remind you that justice doesn't work unless it fits everyone. Someone clapped. It wasn't loud, it wasn't long, but it was the first sound not loaded with suspicion. Midway through, Jasmine paused to hand out a worksheet. Basic scenarios. Phrases like, that's not what I meant. You're being too sensitive. Let's not make this about race. You always make it personal. She asked them to underline which one they'd heard in the last month. Almost every hand moved. Then she asked a harder question. How many of you shut down instead of answering? No one spoke, but 30 silent nods said everything. She pointed to the chalkboard. Listen, clarify, confront, hold. That's why I'm here. Because if we're going to fix anything, we need to fix the part where silence feels safer than truth. Someone from the back shouted, You think you're brave? Jasmine turned without hesitation. No, I think I'm prepared. And I think bravery looks a lot like preparation when the room is built to undo you. As the session neared its end, tension turned into something else. Curiosity. The man who scoffed earlier stayed behind afterward, said nothing for a long time, then mumbled, My wife watches you. I thought you were just angry. But today wasn't what I expected. Jasmine smiled. Clarity rarely is. As they packed, Reese looked at her. You want to talk to the press? Local radio's outside. They want to know what you think about the pushback. She shook her head. Let them ask the protesters what they heard. The question isn't whether I was clear. It's whether they were ready for clarity. That night, she scrolled through local news reports. The headlines were predictable. Tense exchange at civic tour stop. Congresswoman Crockett accused of sewing division. Both sides claimed civility in heated visit. She turned off the phone. It didn't matter, because in the parking lot, a teenage girl had slipped her a note. Crumpled paper. 3 words. I stayed upright. And in Jasmine's book? That was the headline. The next morning began like any other on the road. Weak hotel coffee, headlines Jasmine didn't ask for, and a campaign inbox flooded with noise. But tucked between a fundraising request and a local op-ed calling her an emotional liability with a microphone, there it was. Subject, from East Lubbock, just a note. The sender's name was Marlene B., The email was short. No hashtags, no agenda. Just breathe. Congresswoman Crockett, I'm 72 years old. I've lived through segregation, integration, assassination, resignation. I raised 3 kids, lost one, buried a husband, and outlived half the friends who marched with me in 1968. And somehow, I've never said what I actually thought in a room full of men. Last week, my granddaughter played your interview for me. The one where you said, I'm not being small. She looked me in the eye and said, You've been quiet so long, Grandma. You forgot you could be clear too. I cried, thank you. If your tour ever comes through East Lubbock, I'll be sitting in the front row. No questions, just gratitude. Marlene B. Jasmine read it twice, then printed it out and slid it gently across the table to Reese. He scanned it slowly, then looked up. We don't have East Lubbock on the schedule. I know, Jasmine said softly. He leaned back in his chair, eyebrows rising. You want to add it? I want to build around it, she replied. The original tour route had been carefully crafted. Blue-leaning cities in red states, college towns, union hubs, safe zones where resistance wouldn't smother the message. But Marlene wasn't in a safe zone. Marlene was in a forgotten zip code where the only thing louder than silence was shame, where Sunday sermons came with side-eye warnings about uppityness, and neighbors still use phrases like, that kind of talk don't get you hired. So Jasmine made a decision. They would reroute everything, not just for Marlene, for every quiet soul who never got to clap back, who never learned how to say, I matter without stuttering. 3 weeks later, the Civic Clarity Tour arrived in East Lubbock. There was no parade, no mural welcome, just folding chairs in a dusty church basement that smelled like pine sol and pipe rust. When Jasmine walked in, she spotted her immediately. Second row, white blouse, purple pin on her lapel. Marlene. She didn't smile like a fangirl. She nodded like a soldier who saw someone else finally show up to the fight. Jasmine gave no grand entrance. She just stepped up and said, Tonight isn't about me talking. It's about us unlearning. A few people in the back scoffed. One woman whispered, Unlearn what? Jasmine smiled. The lie that silence keeps the peace. The session began with hesitation, a few polite nods, folded arms, careful eyes. Jasmine could feel the generational weight in the room. Older black men conditioned to survive by shrinking, women taught to be pleasant, younger folks torn between fire and fear. She handed out a sheet titled, The Cost of Quiet. Each line had a prompt. The last time I wanted to speak but didn't was, I stayed silent because if I had spoken, I think. She waited. 5 minutes passed. Then finally Marlene raised her hand. I was 23. It was a bank meeting. I had the best numbers in the department. But when they promoted Rick, the man I trained, I smiled and clapped like it was normal. Her voice didn't shake. Her silence had. Jasmine stepped closer. What would you say to that room now? Marlene looked straight ahead. I'd say, you didn't pass me over. You just proved I was never invisible. You were. The room shifted. No one clapped. No one had to. The weight had landed. Others followed. A teenage boy admitted he let a teacher misgender him for 2 semesters because he didn't want to make it a thing. A retired veteran whispered that his wife still lowers her voice when she disagrees with him, even after 40 years of marriage. A pastor's daughter shared that she'd practiced saying, I disagree in the mirror, but had never said it aloud. Jasmine let them speak, then said, Clarity doesn't mean confrontation. It means you stop asking permission to exist. Afterward, Marlene walked up slowly. I wasn't planning to say anything, she confessed, but I realized, if not now, when? Jasmine nodded, eyes soft. That's the question, isn't it? Marlene smiled. You changed the route for me. Jasmine held her hand and whispered, No, you revealed the route. I just had to stop pretending I already knew the way. That night, Jasmine sat in the back seat of the car as they drove west, past cotton fields and gas stations that hadn't changed since 1983. She stared out the window, not to rest, to remember. Marlene hadn't been a headline. She had been a compass, and Jasmine wasn't building a tour anymore. She was building a blueprint, not for sound bites, for freedom, the kind you don't shout, the kind you own. The road out of East Lubbock stretched long and flat, framed by nothing but telephone poles and dusk. Jasmine watched the land roll past, silent, wide, unchanged. But inside her, something had shifted. Marlene's voice wasn't just a memory, it was a mirror. And as the headlights cut through the coming dark, Jasmine understood. The true confrontation had never been with Bill Maher, or a hostile crowd, or even a system rigged to mute her. The real battle was over who got to define clarity, and who was told to apologize for wielding it. What this story teaches, brutally, beautifully, is that silence is not always peace, and civility, when weaponized, becomes the polished blade of power. Jasmine Crockett walked into rooms designed to unmake her, where laughter masked dismissal, where politeness was demanded only from the oppressed, and where truth was welcomed only if it didn't sting. She wasn't loud, she wasn't cruel, but she was clear. And that, in a world bent on fog, is revolutionary. In every paused breath, between Maher's jabs, every green room chill, every headline that called her divisive for simply refusing to shrink, she exposed a deeper sickness, the comfort of those who've never had to fight for their voice, mocking those who do. Because when a black woman names injustice calmly, the world calls her emotional. When she raises her voice, the world calls her angry. When she wins the argument without raising her voice at all, they call it a moment. But Jasmine didn't want a moment. She wanted a shift. And moments pass. Shifts change ground. That is the lesson that echoed louder than applause. Clarity doesn't require rage. Dignity doesn't require permission. And truth, when spoken without fear, is its own kind of weapon. But the cruel irony is this. The clearer Jasmine became, the more the world tried to distort her. Her words were lifted, twisted, clipped into memes and sound bites. Clapback queen. Too smart to cancel. Weaponized calm. They called her everything except what she was. A woman refusing to perform silence just to be allowed in the room. That's the human cost of speaking plainly. You don't just risk being unheard, you risk being misheard. Deliberately, publicly, endlessly. And still, she didn't retreat. She rerouted the tour. She chose the forgotten zip codes. She entered the rooms where no one clapped at the start, and many didn't even make eye contact. Because Jasmine understood something most politicians have forgotten. You don't need to be loved to be right. You don't need to be viral to be effective. What you need is courage that doesn't bend when cornered, and a truth so steady it can walk through fire without flinching. The lesson is not that people applauded her clarity. The lesson is that they needed it to remember their own. Thank you for watching until this moment, and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything, like subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below, and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.